Okay. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Dave and I have crossed paths off and on at Israel-Palestine Mission Network meetings, annual meetings, and general assemblies since 2006. But all that time, I mistakenly thought he was an ordained Presbyterian minister. So I'm a little embarrassed when I get to the point of introducing him to learn that he's not after all of this time. Dave is a native of Pittsburgh. He received both his MS and his BS and MS degrees in chemical engineering from Cornell University. He moved to San Francisco in 1972 and started work at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Southwest Regional Office, working in 5 different program areas. And during his 35 He is married, has 2 children. Dave is, which worked on environmental and housing issues. In 1989, Dave's family moved to San Anselmo. I imagine he went with them, just north of in the First Presbyterian Church of San Anselmo. As an elder, choir member, and became involved in social justice issues and humanitarian aid. He has taken mission trips to Afghanistan, Palestine, Mexico, Puerto Rico, and locations in the United States. He has been a longtime activist in the Israel-Palestine Mission Network of the PCUSA, and currently is the steering committee. Dave will be an advocate for the Apartheid Overture being considered at the hybrid 225th General Assembly, which begins next week. So I turn the meeting over to Dave to tell us something about this overture on apartheid that he will be working on and advocating for.
Thanks. I saw the invite for the meeting, which did call me a reverend. I guess I speak with authority. I probably learned that working for the government. And it mentioned talking about what is the definition of apartheid and how is it practiced in Israel and about the overture. I don't have any presentations or sharing screens, but when you talk about apartheid in Israel, you talk a lot about roads and walls and checkpoints. So you can go while you're listening to me, if you want to split your screen, to the Israel-Palestine Mission Network website. And on the advocacy tab, there will be a GA part, which has the overture and the maps, if you're interested in seeing the maps. So the UN apartheid definition came in 1973. They call it the crime of apartheid, and it's for inhuman acts caused to establish the domination of one racial group over another racial group and systematically oppress them. And the UN went into quite some detail to give examples of what it looked like if you had a law that was only applied to one group and not another. And they talked about examples of apartheid would be expropriation of property, the right to freedom of residence, the right to freedom of movement, imprisonment with no charge, indefinite prison with no trial, dividing the population on racial lines, creating separate reserves or ghettos for the population, denying them a right to a nationality, and a list of 4 or 5 other things. So how does a state establish an apartheid regime? It's actually quite simple. You come up with 2 sets of laws for 2 different ethnic groups who are living in the same geographical area. So what you would have had in South Africa is that instance, and what you have in Israel is that instance. You have from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River, it's one contiguous place. Israel's in control of it all. There's one set of laws that applies to Jewish Israelis, and there's another set of laws that applies to Palestinians. Now, when Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza in 1967, they, under international law, the occupier should leave as soon as possible and help build a stable government for when they leave. So if you look at what we did in Japan and Germany after World War II, after 4 years of war and losing hundreds of thousands of people and millions injured, we set a goal of, we want to establish a government that's self-sustaining in Japan, that's a democracy. And we and the other allied powers did that in Germany, which was divvied up into 4 occupied zones. And we helped establish a government that could sustain itself, and we left. Israel, on the other hand, fought a 7-day war and never left, and did nothing to build up the infrastructure or the government of the Palestinians. So basically, the UN law is very specific. So it is easy to look at the actions of a government and judge it against that definition. The occupation was under the military. So when you're under occupation, you're under military law. So the 2 sets of laws we have for the Palestinians and the Israelis is the Israelis are judged under Israeli law. Their right to fight something in court, their right to housing, their right to get a permit, their right to move, those are all established in Israeli law. The Palestinians are under military law because they still are legally under military occupation. The Israeli army never left. So they, under military law, just have all sorts of restrictions. They can enter anybody's house anytime they want, arrest people arbitrarily. And then they have institutionalized Israeli laws through the Knesset, non-military laws, which discriminate against the Palestinians. So if you want to look at the UN definition and then look at how does Israel stack up, it is, you could not have something that actually followed each paragraph and each sentence of the UN definition more closely. You have 2 sets of laws for the Jews in Jerusalem and Israel, different than the Israelis. 2 sets of laws for the Jews living in the West Bank in their settlements versus the Palestinians living in the West Bank. 2 different sets of laws for getting building permits, 2 sets of laws for what constitutes a crime that you would get incarcerated for. And that is basically, you could not more closely go down the definition of a law, which the UN has, and match it. And how many people have been to Israel or Palestine from the group? So what you do is you get, when you see it, it is just so apparent. So in the West Bank, it was mostly Palestinians, and in East Jerusalem, 90% Palestinians. They can't get building permits. They can't get a building permit to build their homes except in about 10% of the area in the West Bank. But an Israeli citizen, Israel will expropriate land in the West Bank and build housing, new housing developments on the land that's been taken from the Palestinians, but only Jews can live in that housing. And it really, we call them settlement colonies, because when you go into somebody else's country or somebody else's territory and you build a colony which is only for your people and not for the people who actually live there, and you build an exclusive road to that colony from Jerusalem, which only Jews are allowed to drive on and Palestinians can't, then what you've done is you've basically said we have two sets of laws for housing. If a Palestinian teenager gets so frustrated with the situation that they kill an Israeli soldier or an Israeli citizen, under the Israeli law, within a week, the home of the parents of that teenager will be bulldozed. And that's what happens. 35,000 homes have been bulldozed. Whereas if a teenager in Israel who's Jewish sort of goes berserk and kills somebody, it goes to the court system. You have lawyers. Nobody says, oh, well, let's destroy the house or the parents' house because of that. So two examples there. One is about getting housing permits and where you could build. One is retaliation for a certain crime. There's one set of laws that applies to Palestinians and one that applies to Jewish residents. In terms of citizenship, any Jewish person anywhere in the world since 1948 can come to Israel and they are a citizen the day they arrive. But 250,000 Palestinians were expelled during 1948, and they have no right to return. So again, one set of laws for Jews who wish to have housing in the Israel-Palestine area, one set of laws for the Palestinians. And under the definition of apartheid, one of the things is the laws that are established that create these differences, they're intentional. They are done with the intent of making sure one ethnic group has superiority and preference over another ethnic group living in the same area. So I'm going to stop right there for any questions about either the UN definition or why Israel's laws and practices fit that definition. All righty. So I'm not, one of the biggest, I'm not going to go down every one because I think you get the point, but the separation wall. So it's quite interesting when I went over there in 2008 to plant trees. It's called the separation wall over there, which in Afrikaner would be called the Apartheid Wall. It was built not between Israelis and Palestinians in most places. It was built between Palestinians and their farms, between Palestinians and their businesses. It was built to capture all the areas that have drinkable water in wells. It does not go along the Israeli border, the 67 border, which is the internationally recognized border. It weaves in and out and takes all the prime real estate, basically. And the reason it's separating Palestinians from Palestinians in many places is Israel has really built that where they want their border to be in the end. And so those Palestinians that are on the side of the wall with Israel, they're not going to be there for decades because they are being moved out. And when you think, what is the drivers behind all of this? It's Zionism is a political philosophy. It's not a religion. It was a political philosophy from the 1890s that said the Jews need a homeland. We're never going to be treated equally in Europe. We've tried to integrate ourselves for centuries. It seems to work every once in a while in some country for decades, and then there's some incident and there's a setback. We need our own country. It wasn't Israel, by the way, that they needed. They just said we needed a place. Could have been in South America, could have been Arizona, could have been anywhere. But wherever that place is, we need a supermajority of Jews because we want to be a democracy. But we never want to get outvoted and be in the situation we are in all the European countries. We want to be a democracy, but we want a supermajority of Jews in the land which we govern so that the Jews will always be in control. It means you need the land without the people. If you got the land with the people in 1948, if Israel had taken the land and said, oh, these 250,000 Palestinians that we threw out could stay, or actually it was 500,000, then they would have been a minority. They would have formed their democratic government and Jews would have been in the minority. That is why they have to take land, but not take the people that are on the land. And that is why it is also a colonization in that Western European Jews decided, oh, we're going to go to this place, which is now Israel, which doesn't have any Western European Jews, and we're going to colonize it with Westerners, which is no different than the colonization of America, the colonization of South America, the colonization of Africa. People took their people. They fled for religious reasons from Great Britain or Germany or the Netherlands, where they came to this country and they colonized it. We call them the 13 colonies. That's what they were. We'll take the land. We don't want the people. The only difference with Israel, and so the Zionists, when they thought of this idea, all they were doing is what everybody had done for centuries. The difference is they got the idea when colonization was on the down, when nationalization was rising, and by the end of World War I, everybody was getting rid of their colonies. And they were promised to be democracy. And then in 1945, the UN said, no more colonies, no more occupying other countries. So it's not like Israel is doing something unheard of. In fact, they're doing what the British did 300 years ago. They're just doing it at a time when human rights, expectations of human rights, the UN had a declaration of human rights that are applied to everybody in the world. Those things existed post 1945 when Israel was doing its, or Zionists were doing their colonization into Israel. So that I wanted to give that background because it's not surprising what they're doing. They're just their timing is it's totally wrong. We have expectations for human rights. We have the UN, and we have the UN definition of apartheid. So the overture. I am an overture advocate, but I didn't mean to say that. I advocate overtures. I think overtures are a great thing. So why? People are passionate about so many worthy issues, hundreds of them. It could be, Venezuela, Indonesia, hunger, anything that Presbyterians are working on, hundreds of different issues. And I could go to my presbytery and go, I'd like to educate them about Israel-Palestine. I went there to plant trees in 2008. A little of my background, I was here in 1971, traveling for a month in Israel and Palestine. And the Palestinians had pretty much all the human rights that they had under Jordan 4 years earlier. They could travel, they could build, they could have permits. That is why when I went back in 2008 to plant trees, it was just a totally different world than I had seen in 1971. And the apartheid overture, it goes through the overture process. And like I said, the reason I love it is if I went to my presbytery and said, well, I went to Israel and I wanted to plant trees and I learned that it's apartheid and I want 5 minutes on the presbytery agenda to talk about it, the presbytery would say no. We've got 100 other people who'd love 5 minutes for presbytery agenda to talk about whatever. You can come to the meetings, talk to people over lunch, you can set up a table, but we just can't have our presbytery agenda wiped out by 100 people saying, can I have 5 minutes? But if you do an overture, first you're educating your own church and your session. And then if you send it, a church session sends it to the presbytery meeting, they must put it on their agenda. And now you have an agenda item, which is an educational tool, because almost none of those people, if it's the first time, know almost anything about what's really going on in Israel-Palestine. That's an opportunity to have an audience of really committed, dedicated Presbyterians, because those are the people who go to presbytery, to have an audience. And if they pass it and another church passes it, you go to the GA. They have to put it on the agenda. So now you have this venue of 600, 700, 800 commissioners and delegates who have to read this thing, at least skim it, or at least the people on the committee are going to read it and really think about it. So an overture is an incredible way to educate a church, a presbytery, and the GA in general, the church in general. And so that's why I like going there. And one thing, the Israel-Palestine Mission Network, one of their issues is we never want the GA to go by when there's not an Israel-Palestine overture. And the reason is we don't want people to forget it. If you went 10 years without an Israel-Palestine overture, people might even forget that's one of the issues out there. I mean, there's others, there's Ukraine. I mean, there's so much going on that we want to constantly remind people there's still no peace over there. And actually, there's apartheid over there. So this overture was structured exactly along the lines of my whole discussion. We decided we are asking a very, very narrow question. We say, here is the definition of apartheid by the UN. Do these facts on the ground meet that definition? And of course, like I've said it, they meet it all the way down. So we're hoping to make it very non-judgmental, which is the way I'll end. And then we could take more questions. We have a thing in the Israel-Palestine network. It's called a PEP. And PEP means Progressive Except Palestine. If this was going on in our own country, we call it apartheid. If this was going on in Brazil, we call it apartheid. If this was going anywhere in the world almost, we call it apartheid. But in Israel, because of the discrimination for so many centuries, because of the Holocaust, because of fear of being called anti-Semitic or anti-Israel, people are afraid to criticize Israel. People that would agree with me on 99.9% of social justice issues, all of a sudden on Israel, they're not there. And I think one of the examples of this was the 2012 apartheid overture debate at the General Assembly, because we tried this overture in 2010 and 2012, and it was a little too early. We would have been leaders as a church adopting it then. Now that so many other organizations, Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem, and now the UN has a report that calls it apartheid, it's going to be easier. But in 2012, this is literally what the debate was like in the room. This is at the end. People have talked, and now certain commissioners are revealing how they're going to vote to maybe influence other commissioners. One commissioner would say, I'm going to vote yes, that it is apartheid, because the facts on the ground are so compelling. And somebody who was going to vote no got up and said, I think the facts are compelling. I think it's apartheid. I'm voting no because I don't know how I would explain a yes vote to my Jewish friend. And then another commissioner got up and said, I'm voting yes because, you know, this is incredible inhuman oppression. And then somebody got up and said, I think it's apartheid, but I'm voting no because we have a good relationship with our synagogue in town, and I don't know how I'd explain it to my rabbi or the rabbi we know. Some of the people, it was a social justice issue about Palestine. And to some, it was out of their comfort zone. They made it into an interfaith dialogue issue. I think a lot has changed that since then. One person just said, I think it's a harsh word. I'm voting no because I think it's too harsh a word. I think the 10 years since that GA, there's been a lot of movement. But that is why we always say, we're talking about the laws and policies of the government of Israel. We are not talking about Jews or Judaism or religion. We're talking about states. So that's been pretty long monologue. And wondered if you had any questions, dialogue, observations.
Roger. Oh, go ahead, Roger.
David, did you read the overture in its entirety, or is there a preamble of several thousand words or a justification also similar to what you've just said?
Yeah, well, one, I wrote the overture. And in the Presbyterian, at the GA, you have a very short recommendation section. for an overture. And you're asking the church, what do you want the church to do? What are you calling upon the church to do? So for us in the overture, we're saying that we want the Presbyterian Church to recognize that Israel's laws, practices, and policies fulfill the international definition of apartheid. And then we go on to say the apartheid is legally defined as inhuman acts committed for the purpose of establishing one, maintaining the domination of one racial group over another, and systematically oppress them. And then we list just in bullet form five areas. And then there's a rationale section for which this overture is 10 pages, including 4 maps. And that is where you get into the detail of the roads, the checkpoints. So what we're asking the church to do is very narrow. It's really one sentence. We want them to acknowledge that Israel's laws, practices, and policies meet the UN definition of apartheid.
So my question is, do you have a sense of how many other countries' laws also meet this international definition of apartheid?
There are probably others. Actually,
I would think lots. I'm just
the
curious.
southern state, everything's a issue of degree. I mean, our country under Jim Crow, I don't think the country you could say was apartheid because you could travel around and do stuff, but I would say certain states, you could say that their legal structure was definitely apartheid. I mean, because it affected housing, it affected transportation, it affected all those things. Now, there was no international definition of apartheid at that time. So we would have just said it's segregation, is extreme discrimination. And this definition of apartheid was around for 20 years before South Africa was finally declared apartheid by most countries.
But I would venture to say that there are quite a few other countries, some of them quite large, significant countries, whose government laws and policies would also fit the international definition.
I would think so. And I think the only difference is some, look at some Chinese minorities and how they're treated. Some of it is degree, in terms of Israel seems to just hit every single element of apartheid right down the line. Some countries probably have elements. Theoretically, having just one element of this, someone could say you're an apartheid state.
And I don't know a lot about the overtures. I confess I haven't paid a lot of attention to what other things the Presbytery has taken on, but has the Presbytery already voted on declaring any others? Is this similar in any way to other overtures that have come up, or is this completely different?
It's the only overture I know that asks to say that this meets the international definition of apartheid.
David, does the definition of apartheid take into account anywhere a group of people that is under attack by another group of people? Being shelled, bombed, mortars, etc.? Is there any allowance for reaction to that?
So under international law, they're under military occupation. And it's interesting because under military occupation, like the French resistance, you're actually allowed to try to get your freedom by attacking the other side. I mean, that's what happens when you're still under the military. But I don't.
Is it still apartheid though? That's the question. If you're
Yes, because
defending yourself.
I would say in Gaza, Gaza's so weird because it's totally blockaded on all sides. You can't get in or out. It has splinter groups. It has Hamas. It just has this mix. The West Bank, which is the major area, and Israel really doesn't want Gaza, but the West Bank, they have not, there are incidents where someone, shoots at a settler shoots at a person, but there has not been major violence in the West Bank against the Israelis since the second Intifada in like 2004. So you'll notice that. So that is where also the Israelis have withdrawn from Gaza. So I think the reason apartheid applies to the West Bank and Israel is they are moving 650,000 settlers into the West Bank. They're living in the same area. Palestinians, a lot of Palestinians, 60,000, more than 60,000, still live in East Jerusalem. They're right there. So that your example of apartheid is you're actually occupying the same physical space. If you go to Bethlehem, you can see all the Israeli settlements that have taken over every hill that you can see from Bethlehem is an Israeli settlement. They're commingled with some Arab villages, Bethlehem being the biggest. So that I think is a good example because you don't have an active military conflict going on in that area, and they're co-occupying the same area.
David, I think we were getting into the area of collective punishment on that last observation of one people's bombing another, i.e., like Ukraine, but it's similar to the Israelis shelling Gaza, supposedly to try to counter the rockets that Hamas was sending into Israel, but in fact, inflicting huge casualties and damage on the civilian population. And that was therefore would fit the definition of collective punishment. The same is true of Hamas sending rockets into Israel, but the difference in the asymmetry is startling. But we do, as many of you know, Westminster did pass or submit to the Presbytery the overture on collective punishment, which was approved by the Presbytery and will also be submitted to the General Assembly coming up this General Assembly. And Greg Jones has already taped a 5-minute tape that will present that overture on behalf of Newcastle Presbytery. So the collective punishment and the apartheid overtures are going in together to be for decisions and hopefully affirmations, approval by the General Assembly.
I have a question about who votes. Who has voting rights? Only commissioners?
Yes. So in committee, the commissioners and delegates have voting rights. So YADS, anybody in committee gets to participate in the discussion and vote. But when it gets to the floor, delegates are advisory and only commissioners vote.
Do we know who our Newcastle Presbytery commissioners are for the upcoming General Assembly meeting? I'm just asking. Anybody know? Because we have a climate overture there, which we've been working on for a month or so. And they said you should get to know your commissioners, but I don't know who our commissioners are.
Yeah, they made it really hard this year. So every other GA for like $80, you would get a spreadsheet with all the commissioners' names, and the delegate names, their addresses, not their emails, because people didn't want to get their email boxes crushed. So we were expecting that this year, and we, the Israel-Palestine Network, did a mailing for all the commissioners. And when I asked for the list in March, they said, oh, now we're worried about confidentiality. We don't know, we're not gonna give out that list. And it's like, well, how are we going to mail them something if you don't, give out the list? And I laid it on pretty thick, because I said, we're not allowed to go there in person to Louisville during the committee meeting, because it is in meeting rooms that they somehow are only big enough for the commissioners and the staff and whatever. So we can't see them there, and we can't email them. And I said, if we can't write them, somehow in the book of order, there's got to be a way we could communicate with commissioners. And they came up with, you could tweet something you pay $45 and they'll send a tweet for you. And I said, no, but we have maps, we have all this stuff. And so they finally said that they would trust us. They would send us the mailing labels, so it's not electronic. Or else I would have sent out a list of all the commissioners months ago. I traditionally sent them out 2 months before. I would say, does anybody know any of these people? But if I could figure out how to put this, I think I'm going to look up one thing. I'm going to put up the GA. Oh, if you go on the GA, have you anybody ever been on PC Biz, which is the GA thing?
Yeah, I've been on there a lot lately.
If you go to committee, they do tell you the names of all the committee members. So I was able to find out the name of everybody on the International Engagement Committee. But it was quite stunning. So I'm going to try to call up try to multitask here, which I'm terrible at, and look at this one list. Because I have a list who's on the committee. And it's quite amazing in some way.
Well, we learned that some of our overtures that are in the climate area have no advocates at all. So it's kind of strange the way they work it.
So you have a commissioner that's actually on the International Engagement Committee.
Okay.
It's Barbara McPhee.
Okay.
So that's like the jackpot. I mean, as far as we're concerned, because your presbytery passed it, and there's somebody from your presbytery on the committee. So this is the craziest thing. They do this by lottery. They do the committees by lottery. You can't decide what committee you're going to be on. But I got the list of, and sometimes people, most Americans, they don't know much about apartheid or Israel, what's really going on. So it's quite an education process. Well, it turns out our moderator for the committee is a Mission Presbytery, which passed the Apartheid Overture. Our vice moderator is the Denver Presbytery, which passed the Apartheid Overture. We have a commission from National Presbytery on the committee, which passed the Apartheid Overture. We have somebody from Greater Atlanta on the committee, which passed the Apartheid Overture. And we have somebody from Grace Presbytery who passed the apartheid overture. And we have somebody from Redwoods, which is my presbytery. So we've had commissioners, we've had 60 people on a committee, and none of them knew the issue. And we have the leadership of this committee, and 6 other commissioners have had the overture go through, passed by their committee or their presbytery. So I'm actually optimistic. It didn't make it out of committee in 2012, missed by 1 vote. It got beat on the floor like 60-40. But the last 10 years, there's been 3 Gaza, conflicts, and that raised a lot of eyebrows. And there were more Israeli laws. And now you got Human Rights Watch in B'Tselem and the UN rapporteur saying it's apartheid. This is an amazing stat that's in somebody's testimony. 60% of Jews in Israel think it's apartheid. 40% of Jews in the United States think it's apartheid. And here some Christians are saying, oh, I'm afraid if I said it was apartheid, I will offend my Jewish friend. Well, it's like, hey, maybe if you talk to him, your Jewish friend might actually think it's apartheid. They can react and say, I think it's apartheid and that's terrible, but we've been wrong, Holocaust. They could still say they believe it's apartheid and not say it'd be a good idea to give Palestinian equal rights immediately. But it pretty much is. So great. Any more questions? You've been very generous with your time.
David, I'm wondering if, maybe this comparison is not fair, but if I only have so much energy to advocate for something, and I take a lot of value in advocating for Palestinian human rights, I wonder if I should spend my energy advocating for Palestinian human rights with my 2 senators, or whether I should be working on overtures as you're suggesting.
I work on the senators for this reason. There was a huge debate on divesting from 3 companies who had divesting of the stock of 3 companies who were doing business in the illegal settlements. And that was a huge issue for 3 years, massive at every GA. That, and was actually, this sounds crazy, but there were 2 big issues for 3 GAs in a row. It was gay marriage or gay ordination and Israel-Palestine. All the rest were, yeah, whatever, but those were big. Well, we got divestment. And in 2014, I think, but 2016 and 18 GAs, our stuff started passing committee, 85-15, 95-5. It's like, we definitely had done quite a job educating this church. And this church has incredibly good positions on Israel-Palestine. And we send a summary of all the positions on Israel-Palestine as part of our commissioner packet for this one, because this church is out there. And if they say it's apartheid, it's like, okay, our church is educated. Our church has done about everything our church can do from a policy perspective to say the right thing. So I didn't even know what overture we might come up with in 2 years, but it's not going to be, if these pass, it's just going to be something to remind them the issue is still there. So when you have limited time, pray for this overture and work with senators or wherever your energy takes you.
Dave, can you comment on how the apartheid conditions are impacting the Christian population in Israel-Palestine?
Well, hugely, mainly because they don't care if you're an Arab Palestinian or a Christian or a Muslim or a Druid or whatever Palestinian you are. The laws are against Palestinians. So they affect all the Christian Palestinians equally with all the Muslim Palestinians. When I was in Jerusalem, when I was near Bethlehem, planting olive trees, we stayed with a family one night. And this has been 2008. She would have been alive. She was 16 in 1967, the person we stayed with. And that meant she had 18 years of living under Jordanian rule, where they could build houses and travel and do whatever they wanted to do. And they need permission to go to Jerusalem, which is might be 6 miles away. It's never been granted. Her Christian children have never seen Jerusalem. They've never seen the Mediterranean Sea because they haven't been allowed out. So they're Christian Palestinians. They share the same faith. Their number, though, is dwindling hugely because it's much easier for a Christian Palestinian to get into this country. Somebody knows them, a relative knows them, a church adopts them, as opposed to a Muslim Palestinian.
Is the population now down to a few percent?
Yes. In
2 or 3?
48, it was 20% Christian in 1948.
And now it's a couple?
And it's down to 2 or 3%. Yeah.
It's 1.7 or something like that. Dave, I just posted the names and email addresses of our commissioners from Newcastle Presbytery in the chat, and also the IPMN website. So if you go to that website, you'll get all the information on the apartheid overture as well as the others.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, so you're on mute.
Can I ask, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Sue, you were on mute.
If the General Assembly passes this apartheid overture, what would be the next step?
Well, two things. What it says is they would hope. So this is one of the standard line. There's usually 3 things you ask. One is what you ask for, and then you direct the stated clerk to communicate this to all Presbyterian levels and councils, and then you urge everybody, congregations, presbyteries, to find ways to work together to end Israeli apartheid. So there was a day that, like when we divested, because it was such a big deal at GA, the press was covering it, and it made the front page of the Saturday New York Times with a picture that the Presbyterians had divested. I don't think, especially since it's virtual, many people will be, or news organizations are going to be following this GA. So it'd be great. I'm sure the Palestinians and some groups are going to add us to the list. And one of the things in closing, and it's right in the overture, why are we doing this? It's like a snowball. The way South Africa finally happened was one organization, then another organization, then a church, then a business. And it's just to keep that list growing. And it's with hope. It's with hope if that list gets big enough, Israel might say, okay, we got to do something about this.
Great. Thank you.
Bob or Mary, do you have any closing comments?
We have just gotten an email today about the dates of our Israel-Palestine Mission Network annual meeting. It will be right in San Anselmo, partly at the seminary and partly at the church. So Dave Jones will, I imagine, be helping to host us. And the dates are in October. Dave, do you remember the exact dates?
I got to look at the email.
I'll see if I can find it while you're closing up here.
Okay. And we haven't had an in-person meeting for 2 years, so that'll be great.
Will this be a hybrid?
Yes. Well, wonderful. It was great talking to you today. In 6 minutes, the Golden State Warriors are playing the Boston Celtics.
Go Golden State. Go Golden State.
So, so it's great that we were able to clock this in at 1 hour.
Absolutely. All right. Well, our hearts were with Golden State, or mine anyway. So
I see
anyway,
some
oh, don't
Boston
you do
fans
that.
there.
Steve Kerr is a hero, my hero. Anyway, thank you very much, Dave, for the program, and
Alrighty,
to
thank you.
Bob
Have a
and
good
Mary
evening.
for arranging this. Thank you all for being here. Next week, our program is going to feature Kim Eppiheimer, who is the executive director of Friendship House in Wilmington. And she's going to be doing a program on exiting incarceration, the challenges that arise as people leave incarceration, the challenges they face, the challenges the community faces, and also describe some programs and ministries that Friendship House has operated for some period of time, and a new program, all of which offer opportunities for us to become engaged and help someone who is seeking to start a new life post-incarceration, to find a home in the community and start fresh. So we hope to see you all at 7 o'clock next Thursday. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you, Bob, for the list of commissioners too.
Good night.